Hey everybody, this is Dream, and this video is going to be a little bit different than just the top picks. I'm actually going to break down each team on this two-game slate just to see how this goes. And if you guys like this format, then let me know in the comments below. But I will be going to do the main slate tomorrow the normal way, so I just wanted to try this out and see how this would go. So I'm going to break down these four teams: Minnesota, Cleveland, Seattle, Los Angeles Angels, and just kind of give you my thoughts on the players that are usable on this particular slate. So first of all, let's go and start with pitchers. So Sonny Gray, he's averaging 20 fantasy points the last 10 games. He's the best pitcher when it comes to strikeouts on this particular slate. He's pitched 117 innings and he has 116 strikeouts, which is best on the slate, almost one strikeout an inning. Obviously not super ideal, but he's doing okay. In the last 10 games, he scored over 15 fantasy points in 7 of them, which is the best of the 4 pitchers available. And in 3 games against Cleveland, he's gotten 23 points, 16 points, and 6. And then he has scored over, let's see here. He scored over 20 fantasy points 3 times, and 2 times over 30 in the last 10. Overall, I think he's in a pretty decent spot here. This is the only guy that I think is somebody that you should probably just lock in to start the build. Now, nobody's super expensive here. He's the most expensive one at $8,300. The only real issues that you have from the hitting perspective is Jose Ramirez, Ahmad Rosario, and Oscar Gonzalez. But if we look at the data on those guys, Jose Ramirez is 6 for 31 against him all time, and Oscar Gonzalez is 0 for 5. Ahmad Rosario is 6 for 15 against him in his career. The only guys that have hit a home run off of him on Cleveland lately is Josh Naylor and Andres Jimenez, both lefties, and they've gone 3 for 8 and 3 for 9 respectively in that particular situation. He does tend to strike out the guys on this team as well, so that's definitely a bonus. But overall, I suspect that getting a 20-point game is probably going to be right about the top of what he'll probably do in this particular matchup. And then let's go ahead and look at Logan Gilbert for Seattle. So he's averaging 14 fantasy points the last 10 games. He's facing the LA Angels, is probably the easiest team on the particular slate, except for the fact that they have Trout and Ohtani. And he's in 2 games against the Angels this season, he's scored 18 and 19 fantasy points. He's also gotten over 15 points 5 of the last 10 games, which is worst on the slate. And then he's been over 23 times and over 30 twice in those 10 games. Overall, he's just not as good of a pitcher, but he does have the second best ERA on this particular slate at 3.19, and he's got the second best strikeout rate as well. He's pitched 166 innings and has 56 strikeouts, which is the closest you can get to Gray. Now he's got a really big disadvantage against right-handed hitters, and he has a super advantage against lefties. And that showcases based on the history between the players on this team versus him. For instance, Mike Trout is 2 for 6 with a home run, and Taylor Ward is 4 for 10 with an extra base hit in his career against Logan Gilbert. And then the lefties like Ohtani and Luis Rengifo are combined 1 for 15 with 1 home run. That's by Ohtani, 1 for 8. And Luis Rengifo is 1 for 7 with a strikeout. Mickey Manayak, who is a guy that I think is a value option on this particular slate at only $2,400, he does not have any career at-bats against him, from what I can tell at least. So it looks like that he's probably a pretty safe option simply because the Angels are pretty terrible, but his upside is probably capped at 18 or 19 points. You don't really have any chance of a higher scoring game here. So let's go ahead and get to the next pitcher. That's Cal Quantrill for Cleveland. Now he's got probably the most difficult matchup against Minnesota, who's probably the best team on this particular slate, I would guess. I don't know. None of these teams are particularly great, but anyhow, he's got a 351 batting average. He's 12 and 5 on the season. He's actually one of the worst when it comes to strikeouts this season on this slate, with 164 innings but only 114 strikeouts. So he's almost in the same innings as Gilbert, but 40 less strikeouts. And in the last 10 games, he's had 6 over 15 fantasy points. In 2 games against Minnesota, he's got 21 and 13 fantasy points. And he had the least amount of strikeouts per game in those games for all the players on his team. But in the last 10 games overall, he's also been over 20 fantasy points 5 times, which is best on the slate, and over 30 once. So he looks like he's not terrible, but he's also not in the greatest situation. He is averaging 16.7 last 10. He's extremely boomer bust. He seems like he's scoring 28 or he's scoring 5, which, obviously that's not ideal. And he didn't have a very good game against the Angels last time. I mean, he did okay. He gave up 3 earned runs. So, with that said, he's not really my favorite here simply because he's one of he just doesn't get the strikeouts that you want for a slate like this. Like, you do need some strikeouts on the slate. And I do think that Minnesota is going to be able to get to him in this particular slate. Then we have Jose Suarez for the LA Angels. Now, he is averaging 16 fantasy points a game. Are you seeing some trends here? They're all about in the same area. He has the worst ERA on the slate at 3.84, and he has pretty good on the strikeouts. In 91 innings, he's got 87 strikeouts, so he's okay there. But he does have the worst metrics against left-handed hitters on this particular slate. Now, obviously, against Seattle, there's really only one guy that he's going to have to deal with from the left, probably, and that's Kawar Ali. He's also probably the top catcher on the slate. But, he ironically, he's got the best matchup just from the fact that he's better against right-handed hitters and lefties. But overall, he's also the worst against lefties on the slate. And I think he's probably the weakest pitcher in general. He's only had 5 games in the last 10 over 15 fantasy points. But he does have some upside because against Seattle this season, he's scored 28, 19, and 13 points. And he's had 20 strikeouts in those 3 games, which is actually pretty good, which is higher than Gray's 15 strikeouts in 3 games against Cleveland. And then in the last 10 games, he's had 4 over 20 and 2 over 30 fantasy points. So he does have, all 4 pitchers have, 25 to 30 point upside, but they also have, their floors are extremely low as well. So just to rank them in order, I'd probably put Sonny Gray, then Logan Gilbert, then Jose Suarez, and Cal Quantrill, simply because of the strikeout situation. I mean, there's just not much else to differentiate them from. Gray is unquestionably the best pitcher on the slate, but he hasn't been quite as good as of late. He's not separated himself from any of the guys that are on this particular slate, and they all have some upside based on their history. Cal Quantrill is just the weakest when it comes to strikeout situations. So let's go ahead and get into the batters now. So I'm just going to go through each team and give you the top batters and who's probably ideal to take a look at. So first of all, for Minnesota, we're going to look at Gary Sanchez. Now, he hasn't been very good lately, but he is still somebody you have to take in consideration because he has home run threat, and you got to have a catcher. He's one of only, I think, 2 catchers that I really like on the slate at all, and honestly, he's the weaker one. And also in the games against Quantrill, he's 1 for 6 with 1 extra base hit and 3 strikeouts. Not exactly very good, but he's still somebody you have to take a consideration on this particular slate. At first base, we have Jose Miranda, who has actually been pretty good, 3 for 7 with an extra base hit in his career against Quantrill, and he's averaging 6.7 for the last 10, including a home run. I think if you decide to stack up the Minnesota Twins, he's definitely one of the guys that you want to stack in there. Another guy you might consider to stack in there is Luis Arias. He's hitting 353, and now his points per game is lower than what they really should be, because if you look at his stats, he's got several games where he pinch hit late in the game, and those games count as games, but he didn't necessarily get a hit in some of those. So you do have to. He actually has a better fantasy points per game than what this is showcasing, based on the fact that he's had one at bat in those games. So I think he's a really solid option for this particular slate, assuming that you don't use Quantrill against the Twins. The other guy that I really think is in a good spot here is Gio Urshela from Minnesota. He's hitting 417 for the last 10 games, 8.4. He's also 4 for 7 in his career against Quintrell, with a home run, in fact. So I think he's one of my top plays on this particular slate. And so I think that he's somebody you can definitely rely on to have a good game in this particular matchup. Then of course I like Carlos Correa, and I couldn't find the average stats on him against Quintrell, but he is hitting 405 for the last 10 games, including 3 home runs and 11.2 fantasy points per game. And so I think he's somebody that you definitely have to take a look at as your top shortstop. Now, let's just look at the pitchers. Excuse me. Even if you take the top 2 cost pitchers, you can still afford to pay up for some guys because you're gonna need, what is it, $4,200 per player. So you can definitely fit a guy like Correa and a guy like Urshela on your lineup. They kind of average each other out nicely, so that's a nice advantage. And so if you want to go with the stack, though, with Minnesota, I would definitely look at Arraez, Miranda, Urshela, and Correa. 2 other hitters to take a look at, though, because they're going to be value guys that you might want to consider, is Nick Gordon, who's hitting 281, 7.3 last 10, including a couple home runs. He's not usually a big home run threat, but he's hitting them lately. But you can see he's very boomer bust, so you do have to be a little bit careful with him. But he's in a nice plus matchup in this particular matchup, and he's 7.6 per last 10. And then the other one is the outfielder, Matt Wallner. Where'd he go? Oops. So he's a young player, and he's only played 3 games for the Twins so far, but he's had 14, 0, and 6. Now, he does strike out at least once in each game, but overall, I think he's in a good spot here. He didn't do bad in the minors. He had 247, 376, and 463 with 6 home runs in 50 games. I mean, that's not terrible. So for him, he also got walked quite a bit, though he did strike out a bunch. So he's kind of all over the place. But I still think he's a pretty decent option in this matchup simply because of his price and stuff like that. Granted, you may not need to pay down for a lot of guys in this particular slate because, there's a lot of average price guys on the slate. So, but for Minnesota, I do think they're a very stackable team, and Arraez, Miranda, Urshela, and Correa could be a very good core stack for your team. And just to show you what that might look like here, Miranda and then your Arraez. So you could fit those guys in. You'd still have $4,400 or more, depending on whichever pitchers you use, in order to take care of that. So I really like that situation. Then let's go ahead and look at the Cleveland or whatever they're called now, the Guardians. So at first base, I have Josh Naylor, who is hit 7.5. This is not quite accurate, I don't think, here, actually. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay. He's hitting 5.1, 179 for the last 10. Not exactly great, but he does have 3 home runs. He's kind of due to get going, but he doesn't have the best matchup at this because Sonny Gray tends to be good against he has a better, his WOBAs against the lefties is actually really good. It's the right-handed hitters you have to worry about with him. However, Josh Naylor is 3 for 9 with a home run against Gray in his career. So that's, he kind of bucks the trend a little bit. So he is somebody you have to consider, but his price is a little bit higher than we might like based on his recent output. Same kind of goes for my next guy, Andres Jimenez. Obviously, he's a lefty too, and so he has a little bit of disadvantage in this matchup, but he's also 3 for 8 against Gray in his career with a home run and 2 extra base hits along with a couple strikeouts. He's been hitting 6.2 fantasy points a game over the last 10. He's not a gigantic home run threat, but he can still hit them. But I think that he's probably him and Naylor are both guys, if you decided to go against Gray, they're definitely guys you want to consider based on their output against Gray, but they don't have the most ideal matchups, and they haven't been hitting the ball all that great as of late. The next guy here is going to be the third baseman, Jose Ramirez. Now, he's actually been... He is a right-handed hitter, so he has the advantage in this matchup. But his career against Gray, he's 6 for 31 with no home runs, and so you do have to keep that in when you're trying to decide whether to use this guy. but he is hitting 300 for the last 10 games, including 10 fantasy points a game. And he's also been walked 11 times in those 10 games, so he has potential to score points. Anyway, he just hasn't been very good in his career against Gray himself. Then we look at Ahmad Rosario. He's also in a plus situation with his batting of the batting right-handed. Obviously, he's pretty expensive along with Ramirez, but he has been pretty good against Gray, 6 for 15 in his career, and he's averaging 10 fantasy points a game for the last 10, including a 319 average. And so I think he's somebody you have to take a look at in general just because of that as well. So I like him, and his price point isn't that ridiculous. If you want to come off of Correa, if you want an alternative and go to him, you could do that. But overall, I think he's a pretty solid play in this particular matchup simply because of how good he's been against him, and he's got the advantage from the batting perspective. And then I have two outfielders to take a look at here, one being Steven Kwan. Now, obviously, he doesn't bat the right way for the matchup, but he's hitting 293 and 9.6 per last 10. And he's also been 3 for 8 with an extra base hit in his career against him. And Kwan's just a guy that gets on base pretty good, and so I like him in the matchup regardless of the batting stats and stuff. And then Oscar Gonzalez. Now, he hasn't been good. He's 0 for 5 in his career against Gray, but this is a plus matchup for him. And he's hitting pretty well, 7.6, 286 the last 10 games, and getting some home runs too, which is a nice bonus. So the thing is Cleveland's batters are actually doing pretty decent. If I were going to stack this team, I would probably go with like a Rosario, Kwan, and Oscar Gonzalez, and then maybe mix in Andre Jimenez or Josh Naylor. But it's not a real ideal stacking team. You could even mix in Jose Ramirez in some way, but he's pretty expensive. These guys are relatively more expensive than the Minnesota players, despite the fact that I think Minnesota has got more upside in the particular game. With that said, let's go and get into the Seattle Mariners. Now, they have the worst matchup when it comes, or the best matchup rather, when it comes to the pitcher they're going against, which is Jose Suarez. And they have some advantages here. Obviously, Cal Raleigh, he's my favorite catcher on the slate. Now, he hasn't been hitting the ball super great, but he does have home run potential, and he's pretty much the best only catcher that's really viable outside of Gary Sanchez, who's not been very good lately either. He doesn't tend to, he's very boomer bust, but, there's just really not much on the slate. And if we look at the catchers, I mean, Sanchez and Raleigh are literally the top two expensive guys, and then we have nothing else. So, none of these guys have hit the ball well at all. And so that makes Raleigh the top guy easily. And then if we look at first base, we have two options here. Ty France, who has not been hitting the ball quite as well, 4.7 last 10. But he is 4 for 12 in his career with a home run against Suarez, which is a pretty good average. And so he does have some home run potential here. And he's been pretty decent against the Angels this season, including 2 home runs in the 13 games with 7 fantasy points a game. And then the other is Carlos Santana, who has actually been hitting the ball extremely well lately, 9.4 the last 10, including 5 home runs in those 10 games. Now, I think twice he hit 2 home runs. Yeah, one against Atlanta, once against the Angels a couple games ago. But he's in a good spot here, and he's actually hit the Angels really well. He's averaging 8.5 in the last 10 games versus the Angels with 3 home runs. That's pretty solid, and though I didn't have any stats for him against Gray, but I think he's against Suarez, but I think he's in a good plus matchup here, and if I was going to stack this team, he would probably be the one that I would choose between the two first basemen, but I would actually just go with whichever one is starting the game. Granted, they might DH one, but we'll see when the lineups come out. Then we have at shortstop Dylan Moore. He's not been good against Suarez in his career, 2 for 15 with 1 extra base hit and 6 strikeouts. But he has been hitting the ball extremely well lately, 438, 7.1 the last 10, and he's done pretty good, 6 fantasy points a game against the Angels in his 11 games. Overall, he does have some crossover appeal to outfielders, so if you need to save money, he's a way to do that. But his stats against Suarez directly are not ideal. And really, they don't have a lot of dudes that bat left-handed on Seattle, so there's not a ton of bats that we like that can really give you lots of good hits and stuff from that perspective either. The other guy to look at is J.P. Crawford, who I just showed. Now, he does bat left-handed, so that helps, and he's also 6 for 17 with 2 extra base hits in his career against Suarez. So he might be somebody to take a look at, though he hasn't been hitting the ball quite as well as some of the other guys, only 226, 5.2 in the last 10 games. And then into the outfielders, so we basically just have a couple guys that haven't been hitting the ball very well lately, which is Haniger and Winkler. And Haniger is literally 3.9 the last 10 games. He is not hitting the ball good at all. His price has not even come down for this matchup, but I guess it's because this matchup is pretty juicy for him. But even in the 6 games against the Angels, he's not been good. And so it's hard to trust him right now just because he's been playing so bad, but he does have some potential in the particular matchup. And then Jesse Winkler, who he's averaging 156, 3.7 the last 10 games. Absolutely abysmal. And he's not a huge home run threat, but he can hit them, but it's just not a huge threat. He has not been good lately. And he's had a lot of 0 for games and a couple games where he got like one little base hit or something. His career against, he has, I don't have any stats for him against his matchup, but I still think he's in, he's a lefty, so he does have a little bit of an advantage. Just a mindset, so Mitch Haniger is 2 for 15 with 1 extra base hit and 4 strikeouts against Suarez in his career. Suarez is really just a lot better against right-handed hitters than lefties, which was a little bit surprising that he actually had an advantage anywhere just because of his ERA and stuff. But he's got a small advantage there. And then let's go ahead and get into the LA Angels. Obviously, Ohtani and Trout are up here. But before I get into those guys, I'll go back to second base, which is Rengifo. Now, he is 1 for 7 in his career against Gilbert, and he's been hitting the ball really well, though. 10.5, 300 for the last 10. Now, I'll say that he's had 2 30-plus point games, so he's extremely boomer bust. But he has mixed in some good 8-point games, stuff like that. His price has come up a little bit, though, obviously. And in his career against Gilbert, I said 1.7, or 1 for 7. And so you do have to be a little bit careful with him. But he is somebody you can consider, especially with the fact that there's really no advantage whether you bat left or right against this guy. Lefties are definitely a little bit better against him than righties are. And so then we'll get to let's see here. Then we'll get to Ohtani, and it's kind of the same situation with Ohtani. He is batting lefty too, which is not ideal, but it's with like Rengifo. He's only 1 for 8 with a home run in his 8 at bats against Gilbert. But he does have the home run, and he's only struck out once. It's just that the Angels are not a great team, so they only have a couple guys, and then matchup dependent. I think that Ohtani and Rengifo both are not useful in this particular matchup simply because the guy is better against lefties than righties. But if you want to look at the two guys that I would actually mention Mickey Manayak. He's kind of in the same boat. He's averaging 7.6 the last 10 games. But he does bat lefty too, and that's going to have him at a disadvantage in this particular matchup. But then to the two guys that have a nice plus matchup here, and these are really the only two guys on the Angels that have a good matchup and a good potential here, is Mike Trout, who's averaging 12.3 fantasy points a game with 6 home runs the last 10. Absolutely just killing the ball lately, and so you could definitely expect him to have a chance to hit another home run in this matchup. He is 2 for 6 in his career against Gilbert with 1 home run, so that's also a good thing. And then also Taylor Ward. Taylor Ward is 371 for the last 10 games, 7.9, and he's also 4 for 10 against Gilbert in his career, and so he has some potential in this matchup as well. Overall, I feel like the slate doesn't have very good pitching, and then each team has a few guys that can really get to the pitchers. So my initial reaction is to go with the two pitchers that have the best strikeout potential, which is Gray and Gilbert. But I wouldn't complain really about any of the four necessarily based on the data, simply because even Gray and Gilbert, they have the most downside when it comes to batters they're facing that could potentially hit home runs off of them. Gilbert's going against the Angels, which is the weakest team, but they have two guys that can hit home runs off them. And then Gray, who's going against Cleveland, they've got two or three guys that can. The other two don't really have as much downside, except for maybe Quintrell, who has several guys on Minnesota who are playing pretty well that are facing them in a way that's going to be advantage to Minnesota. I think Minnesota will probably win their game, and I think Seattle will probably win their game, simply because of the matchups and everything like that. But overall, I think it's a pretty decent slate to try to build something together. And I'm sure you can stack two teams up along with the pitchers and have yourself a chance. I wouldn't recommend stacking the same one game like this, like putting Quintrell versus Sonny Gray, because you're handicapping yourself from being able to get a win. And chances are, to some extent, I don't know that any of these four pitchers are going to get a win necessarily. The really only pitcher that I think has a really good chance for one is probably Gilbert, simply because the Angels are going to probably have a more difficult situation in this particular matchup. With that said, I think it's a pretty fun slate. If you have anything that, if you like this format, let me know in the comments below. If you have any comments, questions about any of the players, let me know in the comments below. Make sure to check the description for Discord. Make sure to check out Patreon. And have a nice day, guys.